Epochs! Okay, let me read now from Sir Charles Oman, who gives us a bit more detail about all those years, because Churchill skates over quite a lot there. Now, that's only a very, very broad description of everything that went down. So let me read from Oman. He says this, quote, "In this astonishing victory, i.e. Agincourt, Henry's small army had slain a much larger number of men than they mustered in their own ranks. The Constable of France, the Duke of Brabant, brother of John of Burgundy, the Dukes of Bar and Alençon, and a whole crowd of counts and barons had fallen. It is said that no less than 10,000 French were slain, of whom more than 8,000 were men of gentle blood. In spite of the massacre of captives in the midst of the fighting, there were still some prisoners surviving. They included the young Duke of Orleans, the titular head of the Armagnac faction, or the Orleanist faction, the Duke of Bourbon, the Counts of O and Vendôme, and 1,500 knights and nobles more. The English in this terrible fight had lost less than 200 men." These numbers are all a bit disputed between various historians, but anyway, Oman says we lost less than 200. "But among them were two great peers, the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk. Henry retraced his way to Calais and crossed to England with his prisoners and his booty, there to be received with splendid festivities by his people, who regarded the glory of Agincourt as a sufficient compensation for the losses of a costly campaign which had added nothing save the single town of Harfleur to the possessions of the English crown. The ransoms of a host of noble captives were relied upon to replenish the exchequer, and the fearful losses of the Armagnac party, who saw half their leaders slain at Agincourt, would evidently weaken the strength of the French in the remainder of the war." Henry did not cross the Channel again in the year 1416, which he spent partly in negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy, whose help he wished to secure against the Armagnacs, partly in treating with the Emperor Sigismund about the common welfare of Christendom. Sigismund was hard at work endeavouring to put an end to the Great Schism, the scandalous breach in the unity of the Church caused by the misconducts of the rival popes at Rome and Avignon. I talked all about that in previous episodes, with the Council of Constance and everything. He visited England, Sigismund, this is, the Holy Roman Emperor. He visited England and won Henry's aid for his plans, which brought about the reunion of Christendom at the Council of Constance, a reunion under evil auspices, since it was marked by the burning of the great Bohemian teacher Jan Hus, who had made the doctrines of Wycliffe popular among his Slavonic countrymen in the Near East. Moreover, it restored the unity of Christendom, but did not reform either the papacy or the national churches. As this was not done, the general outbreak of religious ferment was made inevitable in a later generation. After the failure at Constance to reform the church from within, it became necessary to reform her from without. That's a reference to the Reformation, sort of Luther, 100 years later or so. Having come to an agreement with the Duke of Burgundy and obtained from him a promise of neutrality, Henry invaded France for the second time in the summer of 1417. He took with him an army of somewhat over 16,000 men, landed in Normandy, and began to reduce one after another all the fortresses of that province. The campaign of 1417 was much easier and much more successful, much quicker than the campaign of 1415. Henry basically does in 1417 what he wished he had done or been able to do in 1415. But the big difference is, the massive difference is, there's no giant French army of 30,000, 60,000 Frenchmen mustering against him. So it's all laid bare almost for him. It's just open for him to do as he wishes. Almost, not quite, but almost. Oman continues. Utterly humbled by the memory of Agincourt, the Armagnacs made no attempt to meet him in the open field. Some of the Norman towns held out gallantly enough, but they got no aid from without. At the end of a year, the whole duchy, save its capital, the city of Rouen, was in English hands. Henry then assumed the state of Duke of Normandy and put the whole land under orderly government, a boon it had not enjoyed for 20 years. He gave Norman baronies and earldoms to many of his English followers and handed over the control of the cities to burghers of the Burgundian faction, who served the English readily enough, out of their hatred for Armagnacs. For 30 years, Normandy was to remain English. Rouen was added to the rest of the duchy after a long siege of 6 months, in which half the population perished by hunger. Irritated by this long resistance, Henry imposed on it the harsh terms of a ransom of 300,000 crowns and hung Alain Blanchard, the citizen who had been the soul of the obstinate defence. That was in January 1419. While the conquest of Normandy was in progress, the French factions had been more bitterly at strife than ever. In 1418, the Burgundian party in Paris rose against their rivals. Remember, that's the party that's not the king. The Duke of Burgundy and the king and his heir, the Dauphin, are at odds with each other. The Armagnacs, the Orleanists, they're the same thing, versus the Burgundians, who are basically on our side. So the Burgundians rose a party in Paris and massacred every man on whom they could lay hands, including Bernard of Armagnac himself. The control of the party of the feudal noblesse then passed into the hands of the young Dauphin Charles, the heir of France. The fall of Rouen, however, frightened John of Burgundy, and unwilling that France should fall wholly into the power of his ally, King Henry, he made proposals for a reconciliation with the Dauphin and his Armagnac followers. A little bit late, but there you go. The Duke of Burgundy, the various Duke of Burgundies, keep changing sides, don't they? Keep trying to play their enemies off against each other. The treacherous young prince accepted the overtures with apparent cordiality and invited Duke John to meet him on the bridge of Montereau to settle terms of peace. But when Burgundy came to the conference, he was immediately slain by the Armagnac captains in the presence and with the consent of the Dauphin. That's in August 1419. The murder of Montereau was destined to make Henry master of France. Some say he entered Paris through the hole in the Duke of Burgundy's head, metaphorically speaking, of course. When Philip of Burgundy, the son of Duke John, heard of his father's death, he vowed unending war against the Dauphin and his faction, and took the field to help the English to complete the conquest of France. Nor was Philip of Burgundy the only helper that Henry secured. The Queen of France, Isabella of Bavaria, bitterly hated her son the Dauphin, and was glad to do him an evil turn. She proposed that Charles should be disinherited, and that the crown should pass with her favourite daughter, Catherine, to the hands of the English king. So, at Troyes in Champagne, Henry, Philip of Burgundy, and Queen Isabella concluded a formal treaty by which Henry received Catherine to wife and was to succeed the French throne on the death of his father-in-law, the old King Charles VI, who still lingered on in complete imbecility. And that was agreed on May the 21st, 1420. So, 4.5 years after Agincourt. It's one thing to, like in Shakespeare, smash cut from the field of Agincourt to that. It's actually 4.5 years later, and an entire military campaign and a bit of a civil war and all sorts of political murders later. One didn't follow directly from the other, but okay, you get the picture. Oman continues. The Treaty of Troyes put Paris and the greater part of northern France into Henry's hands. Casting national feelings aside in their bitter partisan spirit, the Burgundian faction everywhere accepted the King of England as the lawful regent and the governor of France. South of the Loire, the Dauphin and his Armagnac friends still held their own, but north of it, they only possessed scattered fortresses dotted about in Picardy and the Ile-de-France and Champagne, from Boulogne in the north to Orleans in the south. After taking formal possession of Paris and holding a great meeting of the estates of the French realm at Rouen, Henry returned in triumph to England with his young wife. He had reached a pitch of success in war such as no English king had ever attained before, and the nation, blinded by the personal merits of its king and gorged with the plunder of France, forgave him all his faults. The waste of life and money and never-ending persecution of the Lollards and precarious tenure of the conquest in France, due in sober truth merely to the aid of the Burgundian faction, were all forgotten. Henry had not long been in England when bad news crossed the Channel after him. He had left his brother Thomas, Duke of Clarence, with a small army to hold Maine against the Dauphin's adherents. But the Armagnac bands had lately been strengthened by succours from Scotland, the Old Alliance. Of course, the Scottish and the French will work together against the English wherever possible, under the Earl of Buchan, the son of the Regent Albany. For although the King of the Scots had been a prisoner in English hands for 10 years or more, his subjects and his uncle the Regent were not thereby constrained to keep the peace with England. Pushing forward rashly to attack the Scots and Armagnacs, Clarence was routed and slain at Bouage in 1421. The enemy at once overran Maine and began to infest the borders of Normandy. This compelled the king once more to cross over the sea in order to repair his brother's disastrous defeat. In a campaign extending from the summer of 1421 to that of the following year, he cleared the Dauphin's army out of their foothold north of the Loire, and then proceeded to starve out one by one their isolated strongholds in the north of France, the chief of which was Dreux and Meaux. It was during the siege of Meaux, I'm probably pronouncing that terribly, which continued throughout the winter of 1421 and the spring of 1422, that Henry's health began to give dangerous signs of breaking up. He had been campaigning from his boyhood and had never hitherto shown any weakness of constitution, But the winter colds of 1421 to 22, or the camp fever bred in the trenches during the long siege of Meaux, had brought him very low. He was carried back towards Paris in a desperate state of weakness from dysentery. Soon after, to the horror and dismay of the English and their French partisans, he died at the castle of Vincennes on August the 31st, 1422, before he had attained his 35th year. End quote. So again, it sort of came out of nowhere that he's sort of fine, everything's looking fine. As soon as the old king, only sort of titular in name only now, King Charles, old mad King Charles VI, as soon as he died, which would be any week now, any month now, he was on his last legs and had been for a long time. As soon as that happened, Henry V would have formally been sort of the full King of England and France. But he just dies of dysentery out of nowhere, kind of out of nowhere. And very quickly as well, goes from sort of essentially full health to dead in a matter of days or a few weeks at most. And the old King Charles, he himself only lived for another few months, a couple of months or so. So Henry V came very, very close to achieving the greatest goal of any medieval English king, that to, completely defeat the French and become King of France. He came very, very close, but just dysentery, dirty water almost certainly. He probably just drunk some dirty water and that's it. Life was precarious. I mean, life is still precarious now, let's be honest. One day you can just wake up and you've got cancer, or you just have a brain embolism or a stroke or a heart attack out of nowhere, and boom, you're dead. Life, that can happen now, of course. Back then, life was extremely precarious. You can just die out of nowhere very, very easily. And they did. The average life expectancy is very low, still in the 30s, really. It's not to say you didn't have old people. Some people could live into their 70s or 80s. It was just much rarer. It was just extremely rare. We hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, please head over to lotuseaters.com for the full unabridged video.